All right, we will pick back up with our inorganic compound slide. So a majority of the molecules in the body form organic compounds, which is basically a way of saying that they contain carbon. So an inorganic compound does not contain carbon. Some essential to life inorganic compounds would include water, which is just hydrogen and oxygen by itself, of course, and then acids and bases fall under this as well. So water has some unique characteristics. It is a solvent, meaning that a lot of different compounds and molecules and other things that the body needs dissolves in water. It's a lubricant, and it also changes temperature slowly. So that's what helps us maintain a relatively stable body temperature. All right, mixture versus compound. So a compound is two or more elements that combine to create a new substance. So that new substance has its own chemical properties. So when sodium and chloride come together, they form table salt. A mixture, however, is just two substances blending together while they retain their unique chemical properties. So if you put salt on your scrambled eggs, your salt and scrambled eggs don't combine. They're just blended. All right, so there's a few different types of mixtures, and mixtures, for the most part, are classified by their appearance, as well as the particles within them. So a true solution is when particles of matter, also known as the solute, can be dissolved in the substance or solvent. So in the body, oftentimes that solvent is water, but it can be a gas, a solid, or a liquid, and it must be clear. So fully dissolved, it's clear. A colloid mixture is protein and water, and this can be either in liquid or gel form. It goes back and forth. The particles are small enough to stay mixed, but the mixture is cloudy. So you don't get a full separation of the particles. It still is fully mixed. Suspension, on the other hand, has larger particles. So it appears cloudy or opaque, and the particles will actually settle. So you'll see a little bit of a separation within the mixture. All right, acids. So basically, an acid is a substance that releases hydrogen ions. That's why you can sometimes hear acids referred to as proton donors. So basically, the more free hydrogen atoms, the stronger an acid is going to be. So acids that completely dissociate are quite strong, such as HCl over here, while weak acids dissociate very little. You see there's still a lot that have not broken their bond. So the balance to this would be bases. And so rather than being a proton donor, they are proton acceptors. So they accept those excess hydrogen ions. And in this case, the greater the concentration of hydroxide ions, the stronger the base. So you see in this case, sodium hydroxide, it dissociates as well. So all these free hydroxides can bond with the hydrogens to neutralize it. And then in this case, the sodium and chloride will also bond together. So that in this case, will form water and table salt. So acids and bases have a very important balance within the body. The body has a very small range in which it can function. We'll look at the pH scale here in a second, but the environment of the body is largely influenced by our acid-base balance. And I would recommend watching the animation on acids and bases because I think this is an important concept that can be a little confusing sometimes. So here's that pH scale we talked about. So it ranges from 0 to 14, where 0 is the most acidic, like hydrochloric acid. That's our HCl example. And 14 is the most basic. So that's our sodium hydroxide, that NaOH. So the body functions right about in the middle. 7 is neutral. So the body can function anywhere from 7.35 to 7.45. That's what would be considered normal. So like we said, that's quite a small range for the body to be in kind of that perfect environment. Okay, moving on to organic compounds, they all contain carbon. And so the four major groups are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Carbohydrates is the main energy source. That's the fuel, also called sugars or starches. They have carbons, hydrogens, and oxygen. And basically, the carbons form together to make chains of varying lengths. And each individual unit is called a saccharide unit. Glucose is the primary form of sugar used by the cells, while glycogen is the stored form of glucose. So when our carbs or sugar is at work, glucose is what our cells are utilizing. And then stored in our muscles and liver is glycogen. And when we need more glucose, we can tap into those glycogen stores and break that down into usable sugars. So just a little bit to expand on carb classification. The carbohydrate chains are from those saccharide units. That's the individual unit, and they're classified by length of their unit. So a monosaccharide contains one sugar unit. So that's the glucose, like we talked about, the main fuel for the body, fructose and galactose. Disaccharides contain two sugar units, a few examples. And then polysaccharides contain many sugar units. So glycogen is a polysaccharide. Lipids are our next category. They're quite a diverse group. The big common characteristic is that they're insoluble to water. So lipids are not going to dissolve in water. The subgroups include triglycerides, steroids, and phospholipids. We'll look at each of those individually in the next few slides. But as a whole, lipids function as a reserve energy supply. They supply structure to cells. They help form the insulation of your nerves. They can be vitamins or building blocks of vitamins, and they provide cushioning and protection for your organs. So triglycerides are the most abundant lipid. That's what is usually being referred to when we're saying fat. And it's a concentrated source of energy, although not the primary source that our body uses. So they can be saturated or unsaturated. Saturated meaning that every carbon atom is bonded to the max amount of hydrogen atoms, and these are covalent bonds. So saturated fatty acids are typically solid at room temperature. Think of butter, usually derived from animals. Then you have your unsaturated fatty acids, liquid at room temperature and usually plant sources like olive oil. And that just means that their carbon atoms are not saturated with hydrogen atoms. Steroids is a pretty diverse group, again, that has a whole bunch of different jobs within the body, but the most important one that I want to highlight is cholesterol, because it's a building block for all the other steroids. Cholesterol has a lot of important functions on its own as well. It's a precursor for other steroids, like we said, sex hormones, the bile acids, cortisol as well. Contributes to the formation of vitamin D. So to have healthy bones, you need the good kind of cholesterol. Cell structure, cholesterol is a building block for some of the cell walls, and it's also required for proper nerve function. All right, last but not least, phospholipids. So they have quite a similar structure to triglycerides. They just have a phosphate group instead of one of the fatty acids. And so this is one individual phospholipid. It has a hydrophilic head, meaning that it likes water, and a hydrophobic tail, meaning that it does not like water. And its primary function is to form the structure of the cell membrane. So you see you have a lipid bilayer because you have two groups of phospholipids that are oriented tail to tail. So you have the hydrophilic water-loving head towards the outside of the cell, as well as the inside of the cell, with the hydrophobic tails in the middle of that membrane. All right, proteins, very important, very, very important in the body. So proteins have a specific structure which matches the function, and every single cell depends on proteins to function properly. It consists of amino acids. So amino acids are the building blocks for proteins, and those are broken down into non-essential amino acids and essential amino acids. So non-essential meaning that the body can manufacture them, while essential amino acids we can only get through our food. So we have to eat those amino acids to be able to utilize them. Okay, so here is one amino acid. So there's always a carbon in the center, and there will always be an amino group and a carboxyl group. This R group is what differentiates each amino acid from one another, and it can be very, very simple to very complex. They are linked through peptide bonds. So this carboxyl group will form a peptide with the next amino acid's amino group. And you can have anywhere from 50 to several thousand amino acids. Like I say, it can go from quite simple to quite complex. And they have a unique three-dimensional shape that determines its function. So when it comes to proteins, structure determines function. Here's a little bit of a breakdown of protein structure. Simple to complex. Primary structure is just the sequence of those amino acid chains. In your secondary structure, those chains begin to fold or twist. You then get the tertiary structure, so you get more twists and folds, and it kind of starts turning from a 2D to a 3D structure. And in the quaternary structure, then there's multiple folded chains, or two tertiary structures, or two or more tertiary structures form to make an even bigger protein. All right, next question for our review stuff. What is the stored form of the body's primary energy source? So pause your video, take a second to think about it. Glycogen would be the correct answer here. So carbs are the primary energy source for the body, but we're looking a little more specific than that. Glucose is the most utilized energy source, so we're talking about storage in this case. And then triglycerides are a lipid, not a carbohydrate. They can be an energy source, but not what we're looking for in this case. All right, moving on to nucleic acids. This is, I believe, our last portion of the organic compounds. So the two most important are DNA and RNA, and they are made of building blocks of these nucleotides. So they share adenine, guanine, and cytosine, but in DNA, you will also see thymine, while in RNA, you will see uracil. And so next chapter, when we get into some more about DNA and transcription translation, that'll come into play more. So don't worry about that too much right now. So all the nucleotides contain a 5-carbon sugar. They have a phosphate group and then one of these nitrogen bases. All right, ATP. This is a very important nucleotide because it stores energy and it's how our body uses energy quite frequently. So it consists of a base and then a sugar, and it has 3 phosphate groups. So these bonds between the phosphate groups contain a lot of energy. So when we break one of these bonds, that energy is released so that we can do work. And then when that phosphate group breaks off, ATP becomes ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate instead of triphosphate, since it loses that group. You can also have the reverse of that, where we use energy from nutrients to reattach that phosphate, putting the energy back into potential energy and turning ADP back to ATP. All right, next question, guys. Pick out the true statement. So A, DNA and RNA are nucleotides. B, ATP is a nucleic acid. C, nucleic acids are inorganic compounds. D, nucleotides consist of a sugar, a phosphate group, and a nitrogen base. Pause the video, take a second to think about it. Take a look back if you need to. And the correct answer in this case is D. Nucleotides consist of a sugar, a phosphate group, and a nitrogen base. So A and B were kind of flip-flopped. DNA and RNA are the nucleic acids, while ATP is a nucleotide. And then nucleic acids are organic compounds. They are not inorganic because they contain carbon. All right, that's our last slide for this chapter 2. Next chapter will be on cells. We'll talk a little bit more about DNA and RNA and some of the other functions of the cell.